Yahweh war machine.
2 minutes,
Yeah.
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
I can tell that you wanna see me lose control at the same time losing my soul. Trying to move on the low, but you still can't escape from the view on the scope. If you move, you will go. When the tank's on the ground, better move out the road. Gotta flow like a hookah lounge, who won't smoke? If you choose to provoke, I might loosen the rope enough not to leave a bruise on your throat. The movement's strong, yeah. Strong enough to make a bunch of grown men spray hatred like cologne. We got too much out here going on in the path you traveling, rocky Sylvester Stallone. But you and I leave it alone. Michael B. Jordan trying to get a creed of your own. Just leave me alone. How you gonna talk like a boss? You don't even own the keys to your home. You don't wanna see me in the zone. Blood of a king in my veins, I belong on the throne with a queen of my own. Infatuated by the muscle tone of my body, love squeezing my arm. If we in the war with the other side, why you not taking shots at the other guy? Let me summarize, you advertise black on black crime and antagonize. When I analyze it with my higher mind, I miss my Virgo nature with the fire sign. I can see it clearly through my third eye, point of view higher than the birds fly. No code of honor like the summer ride, they just target practice for me bullseye. You a clout chaser working full time and your paradigm is a narrow mind. All the angels in heaven listen when I'm sharing mine. I'm giving back to the culture, I'm in the back of the Rover. Why you at home with your back on the sofa? I'm having a moment. Your childish behavior, I'm sorry, I cannot condone it. The double-edged sword that I'm swinging, sharp enough to cut your bones through your garment. Yeah, Rock Nation signed a deal with the NFL recently, that's a bonus. And I just wanna know what percentage you getting paid off for your performance. Hold up, Jay-Z, he don't even know you. Nope. Trademark name who belong to. 6-figure check, no consul. Come to a point where you can't undo what you misconstrue. Every day you attack Jesus, animated like Black Jesus. For that reason, he's still undefeated like Gorilla Hebrew from last season. The war machine running circles around our competition like track season. It's hard for you to be a stand-up guy, cause in the spirit world, your back leaning. I'm sick with it, got me throwing up. PowerPoint ready, they ain't showing up. No information, just inflammation. Amazon book sales going up. But I wouldn't buy it, even if I was on a diet and had a little money on the side. I wouldn't try it, even if my life was on the line and they pointing at my body with the 9. Why should I tell them a whole bunch of lies just for them to join my side? El Shaddai, all praise to the Most High. If the Spirit walking with me, I'm fine. You cannot make a decision. I can see that you afraid of the system. I can tell you have no faith in your vision. You rather sit back and hate on religion. I bet you won't walk in the government building and tell them that you want to interview. Tell them that your name is Nimrod and you demand justice and call them a criminal. Burn up their literature right there in front of them. I guarantee you gon' make the news. At least you be finally famous. Look at the camera like, mama, I made it. Have you ever stood in front of the very personification of hatred? I have on many occasions. The devil got multiple faces. Look at the swing of the pendulum. Look at the shape of the pentagon. I walk in the power of Pentecost. I show up and mess with your pentagram. Tanks on the ground, man.
2 many tanks on the ground. 2 minutes.
Shalom, shalom, shalom. Giving all praises to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to our ancestors. And Yeshua HaMashiach for the work that he has done. Show us how to circumspectly walk his walk, fulfill the mission and the great commission that the Most High has given us in this earth in this last day and age. Man, I just want to come to you, family, today, share a bit of information. There's a lot of things that are going on in the unconscious community. There's an attack on our faith. There's being the light to the world, to the nations. And there's just some things I want to address specifically. As you guys coming in, you see the title. Specifically some things that have been said in regards to whether or not the 12 tribes chart is real, whether or not the 12 tribes of Israel ever existed, whether or not the 12 tribes were all of the seed of Jacob, that type of foolishness. But I want to point out to people a lot of times that information is not always delivered in a way where a lot of us can ingest it to where we actually are able to filter it through a space of knowledge and understanding, right? In other words, someone can read something, we can all read the same thing, and it appears that we all come away with a different sense of knowledge or interpretation of something that we've all read, even though the words are exactly the same. Well, it's never because the thing that you're reading that it changes depending on who's reading. It never changes. What changes is the minds of the people and their ability to accept certain things, truths or falsehoods, to accept certain things that the text is actually saying. And sometimes the only way you can understand what the text is actually saying is if you actually study the text unbiased, right? Not for it or against it, right? But study it across the board, unbiased. And oftentimes when people go into the scriptures, the first thing they say is, well, if God is not the author of confusion, then why do we all come away with seemingly different ideas or interpretations of after reading the same text? Well, that's very easy, right? And it's not that the word of the Most High or even the text that we're reading, that the author who originally scribed it or wrote it was confused, right? Because their thoughts and their intents was delivered in the context of the text. But how do we understand and come to know what the context of what that original writer meant, or what message were they trying to convey, or what truths were they trying to deliver, right? We have to get into what is understood as the context. The context is based on the environment, is based on information from the environment, is based on information from the cultural context, and what we're beginning to understand, what's more importantly, the material culture of the time, the chronology, where it falls on the chronological timeline, the chronological evidence, archaeological evidence, right? The political atmosphere of the time. All of these things give context. All of these things give context to what the author's original intent is. But oftentimes people study completely dismissing the importance of getting the proper context or contextual criticism. They often move away from that. The reason why they do it is for one or two reasons. Either they have poor reading comprehension, or they completely dismiss the fact that the author has a specific message that they intended to deliver, and simply because you disregard that message or you disagree with that message, you simply say, oh, it can't be true, or there's no validity to it. And oftentimes when we hear people come into these spaces, right, who are not, especially when it comes to the scripture, they're not biblical students, they're not followers or believers, and you don't have to be a believer to get proper context. Let me say that. You do not have to be a believer in the scripture to get proper context, because the author has delivered the context and it says what it says, right? and it says what it says. Now, these things they can change. If you're reading from language, translation, transliteration, those things have an effect on the contextual criticism of the text that you're reading. And so oftentimes, people try to find the confusion in that, especially when it comes to the scripture, and say, oh, this can't be true because I'm confused about what it says here versus to what it says there. No comparative studies has been done. Nothing of that nature. And so here, we find people like Garfield Reid, who often does this. He goes into a text, and because he's wholly confused about what it is he's reading, he begins to start his research with the confirmation bias because he doesn't follow the fact that if we are saying we're descendants of Israelites or we're descendants from these 12 tribes, and how can that possibly be? And I don't see that for myself, so I don't think anyone else can see it for themselves. We get that spiel, right? And so what they do is, because they really hate the scripture, or they really want to seek the truth, they go on an attack campaign to sort of discredit the scripture. Well, and it can't be done. It can't be done. It's been around thousands of years before us, and it'll be around thousands of years after. It won't change. It's not going to happen. But I heard Garfield Reid on Sonnetta's channel a while back talking about whether or not the 12 tribes are actually real because they weren't mentioned in the Song of Deborah. Now, if you understand the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, it's basically a song. It's a poem or a song. And in that, you don't necessarily see the specific naming of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so because of that, Garfield and others who are ignorant to the information, to the history, often take the stance because if Deborah's song is one of the oldest writings or occurrences, but most scholars tend to agree with that it's one of the oldest texts that we know, based on its context. And if these tribes are not specifically named, then they simply take the position that these tribes must not have existed, or why else would not Deborah would not have mentioned them in her song, or it's mentioned in this poem. And so that's the unlearned stance that is often taken with this. And so they try to use this, as Garfield has attempted to try to do, and sort of weaponize that and simply say, well, the 12 tribes never existed. Or he comes across an article of someone who's also ignorant of the scripture and simply say, see, they also say the 12 tribes must have never existed because they're not mentioned in the Song of Deborah. Well, I want to get into that. And I'm not going to be long. I'm going to be very brief. I'm just going to cut right to it because I got some things I want to read through. Right? I got some things I want to read through. And I want to do it this way. I'm going to share my screen. Let's get into it. All right. Let me share my screen. Let's get into this. Peace and blessings, family. Make it larger on the screen. And let's begin. Let's see here. I want to make sure you guys can see my screen. All right. Trip D's, peace to you, fam. Y'all son, peace to you, family. Asiatic Lion, shalom, shalom, family. Let's get into this information real quick. Let's see. And this is the source I'm going to be reading from. This is going to break this down, right? I'm just going to get right into it, right? Until you get to understanding where if this information is available, you must ask yourself, why is it that people like Garfield Reed will come onto a large platform, as he does on Sinetta Show and in his own, the platform that he has, and simply try to push the narrative that the 12 tribes of Israel did not exist simply because they're not specifically mentioned by name in the songs of Deborah, in the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5. Why would you come out and push that without doing thorough research? But you call yourself a researcher. You're quoting scholar after scholar. You're always lying on what a consensus of scholars says when the consensus of scholars never agree with what it is that you ever have to say. But these things we see takes very little research to understand and to get truth and understanding. So we're going to get some truth and understanding when it comes to the Songs of Deborah. And let's see what's being talked about and what's being mentioned here. Family, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm going to be putting the link in the chat briefly. All right, let's get to it. Right. The 12 Tribes in the Song of Deborah by Johannes C. DeMoore, Campen, and then they give an introduction. And we're going to talk about, I want to read this introduction, right? Because I think it holds a lot of weight, right? It says, in his influential study of the tribal system of ancient Israel, and I'm going to show you why, where Garfield often fails, because he never goes back to the origins of a lot of these arguments that he regurgitates. He never goes back to see where they began. He simply reads something and then he runs with it without ever tracing the origins of where these arguments come from. But I'm going to take you back to the origins of a lot of these arguments and show you what's being done here. Because he likes to say often, oh, you're using outdated information. Your information is outdated. No, your argument is outdated. And you're only regurgitating people who's only building on outdated arguments because they have a confirmation bias. Right? So it says again, in his influential study of the tribal system of ancient Israel, Martin North argued that the two main systems involving 12 tribes must have originated after the Song of Deborah had been written, because this song knows only 10 tribes and does not exhibit any system. Again, it is this guy, Martin North, who first postulated this idea that because the Songs of Deborah doesn't mention all of the 12 tribes of Israel by name, right? That the Song of Deborah must have been written well after the 12th century or the 11th century, maybe closer to the 8th and 9th century, right? And because it only mentions 10 tribes and does not exhibit any system. And when it's talking about system, it's talking about how the 12 tribes are introduced into the text or into the poem or into the Song of Deborah. And because these things are absent from the Song of Deborah, according to him, Martin North's understanding, he formulates this hypothesis. And that's another thing. It's only his theory. But you have people like Garfield Reed who will take this theory that you can't prove simply because it's a theory. We're not talking about a scientific theory, but we're talking about his hypothesis, his theory that he can't prove. This Martin North, and he simply gives it an absolute statement. Garfield does, and saying, see, if you're reading this particular understanding of the Song of Deborah, because these particular tribes are not mentioned, there's no system of introducing them into the song is mentioned, then therefore that means they don't exist. That's what Garfield does. And it's ignorance and deception and simply poor scholarship. Right? But let's continue. Right? It says in recent years, North's hypothesis with regard to the system of a confederation of 12 tribes has been criticized from many quarters. But his insistence on the priority of the tribal list in the Song of Deborah has hardly ever been challenged. Even Helga Weipert, who postulated the existence of a third type of tribal list next to North's types A and B, assumed that the list of 10 tribes in Judges 5 reflects a time when Judah, the tribe of Judah, and Simeon did not yet belong to the pre-Israelite confederation. And so again, what's happening here is that you're having this discussion or this debate that this guy North is saying, listen, all of the 10 tribes, all of the 12 tribes are not mentioned here in the Song of Deborah. Therefore, they could, in Judges chapter 5, therefore they could not have existed at that particular time. And we don't see any tribal system also mentioned in there as to the role and the status of these tribes. So therefore, the system in these tribes could not have existed before 1200, 1100, or even back to the time of the Exodus, 1400, 1500, 1600, and going far beyond that, right? So these tribes who have never existed, they only came about and joined the confederacy, right, of the Israelites, right, well after the 11th century or so, right, or after the time of well after the time of the Exodus, right? And so then you have someone else who looks at his work and said, listen, I don't necessarily agree with you, but here's a different system as well. This Helga Weipert, is she postulates a third type of tribal list, right? And she talks about, because Judah and Simeon is not necessarily mentioned there, that they didn't belong to the pre-Israelite confederation, that these two tribes came later, right, to join the 10, right? Simply because they're not mentioned there, right? So again, this is what they're trying to postulate, right? And this is an argument that people attempt to use, like Garfield, to say that the 12 tribes never existed. But we're going to get into this information and show where they fail here, right? Let's get into it. Let me go to the next page. It says, of course, the validity of such statements depends on the date of the Song of Deborah. Usually it is regarded as one of the oldest parts of the Old Testament, possibly going back to pre-monarchical times. But nowadays, some scholars advocate a later date, right? According to Giovanni Garbini, the language of the song in the Song of Deborah is what he's speaking about, would be earlier than the classical Hebrew of the 8th century, but definitely later than that of the Gezer calendar of the 10th century. However, philological and stylistic arguments are of a notoriously tricky nature. In other words, what he's saying is you can't use specific speech patterns or dialects, right, and styles of how this poem or song was written to really get a good understanding or to give an absolute statement to say when something was written or when something wasn't written or validated. Because you could have something written at an older time, but copied at a later time, right? Using a more modern language, but that doesn't mean that's how the original text was delivered, right? So you can't use philological argument or stylistic arguments to sort of place dates and validate things, right? To give any validity to this particular argument that because all of the tribes of Israel weren't mentioned in the Song of Deborah, that those tribes did not exist. It's simply an argument that you really can't make scholastically, right? So let's continue, right? To begin with, we simply do not have enough extra biblical Hebrew of the earliest period to put much trust in any comparison with biblical Hebrew. Let me read that again, because that's a great point to understand, especially when you're having debates, family, and you're dealing with people who always want to talk about, well, show me this in the original language. Where's your original text? They often say that, right? That's an argument they often try to make to discredit whether or not the scripture was written by the Greeks or during the time in 8th century or 9th century, whether we can't show evidence or prove evidence according as this chronological evidence as the scripture gives us that we are people of old or ancient times. They want to put you in a more narrow, more latter timeline to sort of discredit the scripture, right? So let me read that again. It says, to begin with, we simply do not have enough extra biblical Hebrew of the earliest period to put much trust in any comparison with biblical Hebrew. Moreover, if the song was really very old, it should not be forgotten that tradition tends to eliminate obsolete forms and idioms. And that's also very important, right? Basically saying, as things are repeated or copied, right? What something means or what something meant or a saying meant at one time in antiquity, by the time something's copied and it's retold at a later time, right, in a more contemporary time, the same idiom doesn't mean, or the same phrase doesn't mean the same thing that it means now. Let me give you a perfect example. The term Christian, when it was first used, we understand that the term Christian was used as a derogatory term. But later it became a more favorable term to those who were modern in Christendom. And so they took on the term Christian as a monocle, as a sign of pride in identifying themselves with the sufferings of Christ. Now we're moving into another space, right, where the term Christian now is becoming more flammable to use because of a lot of the false teachings and doctrines and dogma that comes now out of the modern day Christian movement or Christian church, right? So now, and I was having this conversation with a brother, and I believe some other brothers have been speaking about this recently. It's not favorable to us to use the term Christian or to identify as a Christian or a Christian Israelite or a Hebrew Christian or a Christianite, that type of stuff. it's not a favorable term because the Christian doctrine we see today does not line up with what we understand we read in the law, statutes, and commandments in the Torah, in the Tanakh, and even in the first century writings and teachings of Yeshua in the New Testament. The modern term for Christian today, that dogma doesn't exist. It doesn't fit today. They deified Christ now, right? Making him one with God. We know the scripture doesn't teach that. We know Christ never taught that of himself. None of his apostles or disciples thought that he was God. So to take on that terminology today, right, if you're claiming to be in the truth, you do yourself a disservice by identifying yourself as a Christian. Because the way that it's used today in modern terminology says that you deify Christ as being one or equal with God or Yahweh. And we know the scripture does not teach that. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Besides thee, there is none other. So we cannot take these things today, apply them to ourselves today, no more than they could going back to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries and 1st centuries, no more than they could anytime before that. Right? So my point is, certain phrases that meant something in antiquity can mean something very different later on, right? So that's why these things are important to understand, right? The addition, let me continue. Let me read that again. Moreover, if the song was really very old, it should not be forgotten that tradition tends to eliminate obsolete forms and idioms. The addition of the article, for example, is such a minor inundation that a later scribe might feel free to modernize the text in this respect. This is what I was just talking about. Moreover, the style of older texts need not be more primitive than younger poems, as the poetry from the Ugarit amply demonstrates. On the other hand, a later scribe might have introduced archaic elements in this late composition to create an impression of great antiquity. In a different context, it says, I have argued that under no circumstances can the Song of Deborah be dated earlier than 1100 BCE. Right? The most cogent and simple reason is that archaeology has demonstrated that the resettling of Galilee did not start earlier. This means that if we insist on the line of argument developed by Noth, the date postquem for the creation of the system of the 12 tribes becomes relatively short, hardly 1 century. That is, if it is indeed true that the Song of Solomon knows only 10 tribes and does not exhibit any systematical order of the tribes, but in this article, it is argued that both these presumptions or suppositions may well have been wrong. He's just simply wrong, right? We're going to get into it. Right? Let's go down here. Let's deal with this section here. It says, be right here. Nope, I'm moving it. This section here. In any case, this results in a grammatically better text and agrees with us of Yarah to descend in Judges 11, and 1 Samuel 8, 1 Kings 2 and 8. I'm sorry, 2 Kings 8. Of course, one might argue that the translation to descend attested to the Greek or the LXX Targum and Peshitta was influenced by verses 11. But let's skip down. I don't really want to get into that for the sake of time. I want to go through that. I want to go through where we actually get to the understanding of why we see the 12 tribes actually in the Song of Deborah. So I just wanted to give you some context in the background on this. All right, here we go. The 12 tribes. If my conjectural reading for Judges 5 is correct, all 12 tribes are represented in the Song of Deborah. Apparently, the unusual spelling of the name of Judah confused the copyists, right? Watch this. But on the basis of the folk etymology of Judah's name in Genesis 26, Genesis 20, 29 and 35, let's see. A spelling like Yehoda may be expected to have existed in ancient Israel. The possibility that Yehuda may have occurred next to Yehudah is illustrated by the verbal form of Yehudah for informal. So they're talking about the difference in the spelling, right? Not that Judah's not mentioned, but a difference in the spelling. And the spelling is pretty much based on the dialect of the time of the copyist, right? Who's actually copying the actual Song of Deborah here, right? So let's get it. And this is where I want to get into here, right here, right? It talks about the pairing of Judah and Levi is interesting because in Deuteronomy 33 and 8, Judah is also followed by Levi. Now, what I want to do here, I want to go to the scripture. Now, I want to go to Deuteronomy chapter or Devarim 33. Let me get it here. Let's pull it up. Let's pull it up. Pull it up. Let's see if I get that. Hold on. Let's see if I can get that real quick. All right, Deuteronomy 33. Here we are. And right here. Here we go. Right, and I want to read this, right? And it says, starting at verse 4, it says, Moses commanded us a law, even the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. And he was king in Jeshurun. And when the heads of the people and the tribes of Israel were gathered together, right? It says, verse 6, let Reuben live and not die, and let not his men be few. And this is the blessing of Judah. And he said, hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him unto his people. Let his hands be sufficient for him, and be thou in help to him from his enemies. Deuteronomy 33 and 8. And of Levi, he said, let thy Thummim and thy Urim be with the Holy One, whose thou didst prove at Massah, and with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah, right? Now, why is this important here, right? Why are we reading these two verses here, right? Because we want to show here that we have Judah mentioned first, right? And then we have Levi mentioned, right? And so, in other words, in verses 7 and 8 in chapters 33 in the book of Deuteronomy, we have pretty much Judah and Levi pretty much together, right? We have Judah and Levi together. Now, let's go back to what we're reading here, right? Let's go back to what we're reading, right? It says the pairing of Judah and Levi is interesting because in Deuteronomy 33, Judah is also followed by Levi, whereas Levi precedes Judah in Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 29, verse 34. The reason why they're showing the differences is because when we get to the Song of Deborah, you're going to see the system of how these tribes are named and mentioned. So if someone is going to look for these tribes listed in a particular type of way, we know that's not always necessarily the case in Scripture, because based on what's going on at the time, certain tribes were brought out or brought forth more prominently than others, depending on how the Most High was dealing with them at times. So in the Song of Deborah, this is wartime. This is wartime. So we clearly see that a difference in the systematic or the military system of the tribes of Judah. I'm sorry, of the tribes of Israel, right? They're given different positions at different times throughout the scriptures, right? And how they're named, right? This all goes into why you don't see certain tribes, seemingly specific tribes named by certain names in the Song of Deborah. We're going to get into that, right? It says here, in Judges 5, there appears to Judges 5 and 13 appear to know about a military role of the Levites. You see what I'm saying? It is a mistake, however, to think that this secular role of the tribe could not be combined with his services at the sanctuaries. So, in other words, even at time of war, everybody went to battle. Even the Levites had a role. In the Song of Deborah, remember I talked about context, this is placed during the time of war. The Song of Deborah is out of a time, it's at a time when Israel is at war. So all of the tribes have a duty in the military system of Israel, right? But yet we see Levi has a military role, but also has still keeping up with his sanctuary duties, right? For the temple. So let's keep going. Right here. However, to think that this secular role of the tribe could not be combined with his services at the sanctuaries, right? Right now, watch this. So we know we have Judah and Levi paired together in the book of Judges. Now watch this. Ephraim is paired with Benjamin in Judges, right? In Judges 5 and 14. Let's go to that, as a matter of fact. Let's just go to Judges. Right? And let's go down to, I think we're going to be right at the 13th. Here. Yep, here it is right here. Judges 5 and 14, right? Out of Ephraim was there a root of them against Amalek. Out of thee, Benjamin, among thy people, out of Machah came down governors, and out of Zebulun they that handled the pen of the writer. So we see Ephraim here, we see Benjamin here, we see another tribe here, which is going to be very important in understanding. Machir here, Zebulon also, right? So let's count these up. 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 Let me go back here. Right, so we have Ephraim, Benjamin. We have Machir here, Zebulon, Judges 5 and 15, and the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, right? Issachar is there. And also Barak, and he was sent out in foot into the valley for the divisions of Reuben. He is Reuben, right? Watch this. Why abodest thou among the sheepfolds to hear the bleatings of the flocks? For the divisions of Reuben there were great searching of heart. Watch this. Gilead abode beyond Jordan. And why did Dan remain in ships? Asher continued on the seashore and abode in his breaches. Zebulun and Naphtali were a people that departed their lives unto the death in the high places of the field. Right? So as we're going through here, we're seeing the tribes that are named here. Now you would say, well, I only see 10 of the tribes, but let's just go back and see what happens here. What's going on here? Just a lot of this information here. We could go on hours, but I'm really trying to condense it as quickly as possible. Right. So it says Ephraim is paired with Benjamin in Judges 5 verse 14. This agrees with the many lists which put the names of Joseph and or Ephraim and Manasseh, right, and Benjamin together, right? We see this in Genesis 35 and 24, right? Also in Numbers, the first chapter, verses 10 to 11, 32 through 6, and so on. And so we see here again, Machir, Zebulun, and Issachar are grouped together in the next few lines. The pair Zebulun and Issachar is well attested, right? Now watch this. Machir appears here as an independent tribe, whereas in other traditions, he is made a son of Manasseh. So even though we don't see Manasseh necessarily named in Judges chapter 5, we see here that he's represented by Machir because he is a son of Manasseh. So he's actually represented there. So now we can add Manasseh, Benjamin, Joseph, right? Because we have Ephraim here, Joseph, Benjamin, right? We can now say these tribes, we can add these tribes to that list now. So now our list is growing from 10 to 11. Because now we see we can add Manasseh, right? Because his son Machir is there as representative of him there in Judges chapter 5. Machir appears here as an independent tribe, whereas in other traditions he is made a son of Manasseh. After a stroke condemning Reuben, there follows the pair Gilead. Well, hold on. Who is Gilead? Who is Gilead? We clearly see Gilead. Let's go back real quick. Let's look at it. Let's go back and find it. We clearly see Gilead mentioned in Judges 5 and 17. Right? So who is Gilead? Let's go back. Let's talk about it. Right? After a stroke condemning Reuben, there follows the pair Gilead and Dan, which we just read in Judges 5, verse 17. This must correspond to the pair Gad and Dan attested in Deuteronomy 33, 20, chapter 33 and 20 through 22. Let's go back and look at that. Let's go back and look at that. We'll put that in here. Let's go to Deuteronomy 33. Let's go to Deuteronomy 33. We're here. And here we are, verse 20. Right? It says, and of Gad, he said, blessed be he that enlarges Gad. He dwelleth as a lion and teareth the arm from the crown of the head. Right? Verse 21. And he provided the first part of himself, because there is in a portion of the lawgiver was he seated, and he came with the heads of the people, and he executed the justice of the Lord and his judgment with Israel. And of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's whelp, he shall leap from Bashan. Right? So now we see right here, they shall call the people unto the mountain, there they shall offer sacrifices in righteousness, for they shall suck of the abundance of the seeds and of the treasures here in the land. Who is that? Gad, Dan, Naphtali, and Asher. We see those tribes being mentioned in groups together here in Deuteronomy chapter 23. Right? Let's go back. Let's go back. Shalom to you, Yashar. Tanks on the ground, family. Motivated, focus. Source up and shut up, man. Tanks on the ground. Indigenous back, man. Peace to you, family. Now let's go back. We're talking about why we know that all of the 12 tribes of Israel are in fact represented in the Song of Deborah. Right? This is what we're talking about here. This is what we're discussing. Because you have people like Garfield Reed says the 12 tribes can't be, they don't exist because they don't even exist in one of the oldest known poems or texts or writings in the Bible, which is the Song of Deborah. They're not even mentioned there with the other tribes. So how can these certain tribes be real? How can Gad be real when Gad is not mentioned by name? How can Asher be real when they're not even mentioned by name in the Song of Deborah? But we clearly see that Gilead mentions in Judges 5, I believe 5 and 17, that's actually a root out of the tribe of Gad. So they are mentioned there. Manasseh is not mentioned by name in the Song of Deborah. But why can we say that they're represented there? Because we see the son of Manasseh, Machir, Machir, is also mentioned in Judges chapter 5. So these tribes are represented there. I may not go, even if I don't show up to a particular place, but I send my son, I'm sorry, I only have one son, but I send my son and my steed. He's still representing my tribe. He's still representing my name. He's still representing me. So this is why we can say that the tribe of Manasseh is also represented in Judges chapter 5, because we see Machir is there in his name. Same thing with Gilead and Gad. Let's continue. Right? And it's important to understand that these tribes throughout scripture, some of these tribes are always grouped together. So oftentimes they sojourn together. So when you seen one, you seen the other. When they moved, when they migrated together, you seen one tribe, the other tribe was not far behind. They was mixed in with each other a lot of times. So Micah, who was a son of Manasseh, was among Zebulun and Issachar. They were grouped together. We know Zebulun and Issachar throughout the text, throughout the scripture, was always grouped together. So when you're reading the songs of Deborah, this is how you have to understand in Judges chapter 5. This is why you don't see all of the names specifically named, but you do see all of the 12 tribes represented. And that's the name game. That's the play that people like Garfield try to skirt around. All of the 12 tribes are represented here. Right? Let's continue. Again, we see Gilead and Dan. This must correspond to the pair that Gad and Dan attest in Deuteronomy 33, verses 20 and 22, as well as Dan plus Gad. Let's go. Let's keep going. Attested in Genesis. In Genesis, I think it's 59. Was it 59? 39? 16. Because this is a fairly rare combination. Usually, watch this. The sons of Zilpah, Gad, and Asher are paired. It is certainly significant. This is underscored by the fact that also the next pair, right, Asher and Naphtali, is attested in other lists. So we see often Asher and Naphtali are often paired together in scripture. These tribes migrated together. They moved together, right? Oftentimes. It says, it appears that if our conjectural reading of Judges 5, verses 13 to 14 is accepted, the Song of Deborah also knew a system of 12 tribes. That's a fact. What the Song of Deborah is doing, it's telling you how these tribes are grouped together, how they're moving together, the descendants of these of their ancestors. We see the descendant of the son or the descendant of Manasseh Machir. We see that tribe being named. We see Gilead, who's out of the root of Gad, right, is mentioned there. So all of the tribes of Israel are accounted for. They're all represented in Judges chapter 5 in the Song of Deborah. I want to hammer that home for people, right? Again, it says, it appears that if our conjectural reading of Judges 5, verse 13 and 14 is accepted, the Song of Deborah also knew a system of 12 tribes. This list shows a few irregularities as compared to the more standardized list, but clearly it shows a fairly regular structure of sequences of tribes. And you got to understand, a lot of these tribes, when they use these namings of these tribes, they weren't always necessarily given in the same order, because if they were going into military structure or battle, then certain tribes had certain specific skills of war. Right? So sometimes you would lead with one tribe and not the other tribe. Sometimes you would hold one tribe back and send them forward and pair them with another tribe who had a different skill set. But that doesn't mean, and oftentimes it was their sons, right? Because you see fathers training their sons, right, to be daggermen or swordsmen or archers or whatever. And so they would pay. And so even the workers of the irons, the smiths, those people, the seafarers, right? You would see that these particular tribes had different particular skill set, things that were specific to that tribe that they could provide the best of in war, right? And so oftentimes going into battle, military strategy says, hey, look, we're going to see who's the best in guerrilla warfare in these particular instances. So that's why you don't always see them named in the exact same order. Doesn't mean that one came later or one came before, or one came later or after or didn't exist or none of that. These tribes were listed based on their skill set and how they perform well militarily. Simple as that. Simple as that. Simple as that. And so let's continue. And we're going to look at this, right? And show you, right? Again, on the level of pairs, there is a high degree of correspondence with other lists that are often held to be old, especially in Genesis and Deuteronomy. But the list coming close to that of Judges 5 in the form that we reconstructed is the list in Joshua, right? 23 and 29, as the following table shows. Now watch this. Let's go to Joshua 23. No, I'm sorry, Shalaki, Joshua 13. Joshua 13. Let's go to Joshua. I think I want to use this one though. Let's go to the book of Joshua. Go to Joshua 13 chapter. Right? Now watch this. This is Joshua 13. I'm just going to start at the 6th verse. All the inhabitants of the hill country, I'm reading Joshua 13, starting at the 6th verse. All the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon unto the Mizraim and all of the Sidonians, them will I drive out from before the children of Israel. Only divide thou it by lot unto the Israelites for an inheritance as I have commanded thee. Now watch this. Verse 7, now therefore divide this land for an inheritance unto the 9 tribes and the half tribe of Manasseh, with whom the Reubenites and the Gadites have received their inheritance. So again, we see Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh, being grouped along with the Reubenites and the Gadites, which Moses gave them beyond Jordan eastward, even as Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them. From Arer, that is upon the bank of the river Arnon, and the city that is the midst of the river, and all the plain of Medeba unto DEBORAH. Y'all see that? We have in Joshua chapter 13, we have Manasseh, the Reubenites, and the Gadites together. And then it talks about the 9.5 tribes. That's basically what it says. The half tribe of Manasseh. Why? Because they were part Egyptian. They were of the sons of Joseph. One of the sons of Joseph. Right? So let's go back. Let's go back to our study chart. And let's show this, right? So in Judges 5, where we have the Song of Deborah, right? You have here the tribe of Judah. And the only thing difference here, why they're showing right here, because in Judges, it's sort of spelled out this way. But that's only because of a later copyist dialect and how we spoke. But it's clearly the tribe of Judah here. Clearly the tribe of Judah here. Right? And then Levi, right? And then Ephraim, right? If you went into Joshua 13, though, you would see Judah, Levite, and in that order. But then you would see of the tribe of Joseph, you would see what? Manasseh and Ephraim. But in Judges 5, you only have Ephraim mentioned. It's the same thing. Benjamin, Judges 5, Joshua 13. Now, right here, you have Micah and you have Simon in that order, right? But then you have, again, if you go back to Judges 5 and Joshua 13, you have Zebulon mentioned in the same order. Issachar mentioned in the exact same order. Reuben mentioned in the exact same order. Again, Judges 5, you had Gilead, but then in Joshua, what do you have? You have Gad, right? Why do you have Gilead and Gad here? Because Gilead is of the descendants of Gad. That is why. That is why Gad is represented in Judges 5, even though it's not specifically called the tribe of Gad. Gilead is a descendant of Gad, right? Here, Judges, you have Dan is mentioned, Judges 5. You have Joshua mentioned, and you have, Shalaki, you have Asher mentioned there in that order. But then again, right after, you have Asher mentioned along with Naphtali, and then you have Naphtali here in Dan. So you clearly see that based on the military need in the book of Joshua, right, in the 13th chapter, based on the military need, you see some of these tribes called to order very differently, right? And sometimes based on their sheer numbers alone, their order and tribe are mixed up. But mostly from the book of Judges to Joshua, you clearly see the order is almost identical. Almost identical. What do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 tribes that are represented in the book of Judges, chapter 5, which is what's understood as the Song of Deborah. And so oftentimes when we hear people say, why aren't these tribes mentioned specifically? Their sons have gone before them. Their descendants have gone before them in their stead. And so a lot of these times what we come to understand that you could have a very large tribe or a small tribe, but within these tribes, you also had chieftains, right? Or you had others who had large families, right? And Micah was of the tribe of Manasseh, but he had a very large family himself, right? But he was of the tribe of Manasseh. So this is why we can clearly say, with just a little bit of brief study, family, that all of the 12 tribes of Israel are mentioned in the Song of Deborah, right? Let me get down to this last point here. Usually Joshua 13 is attributed to the priestly source, and they're talking about the documentary hypothesis when you have the P source, the J source, the P source, the E source, and the D source. They're talking about the documentary hypothesis. It talks about with the well-known problem whether or not P made use of genuine old materials such as list of cities and boundaries in these chapters. The question is whether the order of the tribes in Joshua 5 may have been derived from the P list. This seems to be an unlikely supposition. Let's go to the next one. Supposition that choosing of the new no, that's not it. Let's go here. We want to read. I want to read something here. Yeah. That the choosing of the new gods, the stars, the warning of Yahweh, the close parallels between the killing of Caesarea, the Ugaritic, legend of Aquata, and the prominent role of the human helpers of Yahweh all argue against a late dating, right? A late dating against the Song of Deborah. So, these things go against the late dating, right? So it says, moreover, the false interpretation of this defectively written consonant text of Judges 5 and 13, 14 could hardly have occurred if the order of the tribes had been derived from the P list. So they pretty much are saying you can't apply the documentary hypothesis to Judges 5 based on the namings of the tribes. It does not correlate, so you can't use the documentary hypothesis to explain this. It says, and finally, the equation Mecher Simeon, which we discovered, argues in favor of the priority of Judges 5, because this equation runs counter to the tradition which makes Mecher a son of Manasseh. So anything that goes against that, which we know the scripture tells us that the tradition holds that Mecher was a son of Manasseh, but it does expose a hidden wordplay in the book of Genesis where it talks about Simeon and Levi are brothers, right? Weapons of violence are their trade. So you have to understand, again, when these people were listed, it was based on a military system, right? So the derivation of Makatayam from the root Makar to trade renders it likely that originally Makar simply meant trader, right? Akedi Mikaru, Mikaru, later Hebrew Mokir. This would make the Simeonites traveling salesmen, which might offer another explanation for their later disappearance. If Judges 5 cannot be dependent on Joshua 13, we might be tempted to assume that the direction of borrowing was from the other way around. Could the order in Joshua 13 reflect a pre-monarchical list of tribes resembling the list preserved in Judges 5? Question. Unfortunately, this too is unacceptable because, like all lists headed by Judah, the list of Judges 5 and Joshua 13 stands under the suspicion of reflecting the rise of the Davidic dynasty. And since Ephraim follows Judah closely in this list, it is almost certainly also presupposes the division of the land under Rehoboam, right? So it's just basically giving you a history on why we can pretty much count on the fact that the Song of Deborah in Judges 5 was written at a much later time than we see the monarchical reign in the 10th century BCE during the time of Saul and King David, or the Davidic dynasty comes into power, right? Let me see. Let's see something else. I wanted to get into breaking down the difference between the Kentickle and Strove. I wanted to get down into that, but I don't think that's necessary for this. But let's move a little bit further. I want to read you guys something as well. Let's go. Here. Let's read this, right? Let's just get down to the conclusion, right? It says the high level of regularity in the poetic structure we found seems to suggest at least the possibility that the original order of the list of 12 tribes in the Song of Deborah was the same as that of the genealogy of Jacob's sons in Genesis. It was changed then shortly after the division of the country into two kingdoms to meet the new political realities. In that, or for a very similar form, it became the source of inspiration for the P source or the priestly source. When we're talking about the documenting hypothesis, or his post-exilic disciples who composed Joshua 13. The triads found in the marching order of Numbers, second chapter 10, is also priestly source, seem to go back to a division of the 12 tribes into groups of 3. That is also reflected in a strophic division of Judges chapter 5, verses 13 to 18. And these verses are rearranged accordingly to the order of Genesis. Right? And so here we see these orders that they break down, right? So Judges chapter 5 verses Numbers, the second chapter, we see Reuben, Machir, and Simeon is always grouped together in the second order. Levi and Gad is grouped together in the second order. Judah is always in the first order. Zebulun, Issachar, first order. Issachar, Zebulun. And the reason why these first groups, they're listed in the groups, these first groups, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, because these were your best warriors. These were your best warriors, right? These were this was the strength. This was the muscle of Israel, right? Judah, Zebulun, and Issachar, right? This was the muscle, the muscle. Then you had Reuben, Simeon, Gad, and Levi in that order. People often think that Levi, because they were given the role to maintain the sanctuary, temple, and the victuals and everything, that these men were weak. Don't fool yourself. The Levites would take you out of here. The tribe of Levi, these were not no weak priests with no Catholic walking around with no Catholic clergy collars on. No. They often carried swords with them. They were often armed. They were known to be fierce warriors, right? But here's your muscle right here, the first order. Then you had Dan, Gilead, and Asher, Naphtali, always mentioned in the fourth order. And another thing, a lot of these tribes weren't as large in number as some of the other tribes listed in the first and second order as well, either. So we have to keep all of that in mind. So again, I just wanted to come on really briefly and really show that when you're dealing with these people like Garfield and different things like that, who wants to tell you that the 12 tribes chart can't be trusted, or the 12 tribes of Israel is of no effect because the Song of Deborah never mentions them. Well, we know and just showed and proved that they are actually represented. All of the 12 tribes are represented in the Song of Deborah. So, what I'm going to do now is just briefly drop the link in the chat. If anybody wants to come on. Shout out to you, Azar Jones. Peace to you, Kofi. Peace to you, family. I wanted to say this too as well. The scripture tells us, man, to watch as well as pray, right? And if you notice what's going on in the world today, especially, and I'm gonna do this sometime, maybe next couple of days, the most I will. We're gonna talk about why there's a couple of things that happened this week. A couple of things that happened this week that I want to bring the family's attention to. And one of them is Roe versus Wade. The decision came down today, a 6-3 decision in favor of striking down Roe versus Wade. The 1970s ruling that allowed abortion to be made legal in this country. That law was struck down today. And they're leaving it up to the states. Right? They're leaving it up to the states. These things are important to know, family, because it is my belief that these things now are a sign of the times where this country is about to see unprecedented unrest, civil unrest. We say, well, what about the Civil War? Yeah, like that. Yeah, we need to be preparing our minds for these things. Let me show you something, family, real quick. Show y'all some things that happened this week. Let me show y'all some things that happened this week. If I can find it, we're gonna get into it. I want y'all to see something. So let me pin these two things down real quick. And then I'm gonna come on and I'm gonna show these real quick. All right, so let's take a look at this, family. I want to share my screen. Gotcha. All right, share my screen. First article I want to go to is this one right here. Now, if you're not aware today, family, right? Fair use. Let's look at this article right here. Right? If you hadn't noticed today, there's a 6-3 again. The 6-3 decision came down, overturning Roe versus Wade. They're going to live up to states.
Unite the country. He promised that he would on every issue.
But let me that's this, right? Let's watch this, right? It says Biden calls on Congress to restore Roe versus Wade abortion protections as federal law. This is not over. Biden urged protesters to remain peaceful after Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade. It said President Biden on Friday or today urged Congress to restore the abortion protections of Roe versus Wade by codifying abortion rights into federal law after the Supreme Court ruled Friday overturned the landmark decision while urging protesters to remain peaceful and saying violence is never acceptable. The president from the White House Friday slammed the high court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, which protected a woman's right to choose and her right to make intensely personal decisions with her doctor free from interference of politics. Now, again, family, you have to understand what's going on here, right? These things have been Roe versus Wade. These things are looked at as quote unquote, whether you're pro-choice, pro-life, these things have been argued on the lines of religious and spiritual belief. Not even a medical decision, but religious and spiritual belief. Right? Religious and spiritual belief. And the reason why I'm saying this is because people, you have certain people that believe that there is a creator God, right, who is the source of all life, and because of that, life is sacred, and that no one has the right to take a life based on what we read in the scriptures in regards to thou shalt not murder, or interpreted more appropriately, more accurately, thou shalt not murder, right? When the scripture says thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder, right? Murder goes along with intent. And justification, right? It's the difference between, I've always argued this many times on many different platforms, had this debate oftentimes with Jabari, and had it often with Sonetta, all killing is not murder, right? There's a such thing as righteous killing, right? This is why even in the court system you have what they call justifiable homicide, right? There is a such thing as the ability to protect yourself, right? Protect your family. Sometimes that results in the loss of life, right? But it all goes into your intent. If someone's attempting to break, or someone breaks into your home while you and your family are sleeping, and you don't know what their intentions are, but if they're breaking the law, they enter your home, and you so happen to be armed, right? And you have a weapon or gun to protect yourself from these evils that are out here in the world, people who come to do you or your family no harm. The scripture says you should protect your family by any means necessary. Protect your family. And so if you shoot that intruder and you kill them, you're justified. In this country, many other countries, almost every other country there is that exists, you're justified. You're justified in the scriptures. That's a righteous killing, right? That's a righteous killing. But if you take your gun and you shoot somebody because they stepped on your new Jordans, scuffed them up, that's not a righteous killing. That's murder. So there's a difference in that. But again, we're at the Roe versus Wade, and it's been overturned today. And before I go further, I want to read you a second article. Let me read you a second article. Hopefully I can get it. Let me see if I can find a better one. Here we go. This is on the LA Times. Right? Let's try to see what's going on here. The Supreme Court rules for parents seeking state aid for religious schools. Right? There was an argument between whether or not the Constitution or the law allows for the quote unquote the separation of church and state. And because if you had a religious organization that ran a school, it will start to be unconstitutional for a state or federal government to subsidize that school because of its religious affiliations and its religious dogma or doctrine that it may push, that it may teach to a student, right? And so oftentimes that was looked at as was most people would consider, and often not really fully understanding it, but I won't go into that, but what they call separation of church and state. But now you have the Supreme Court. Let me close this down. Now you have the Supreme Court rules for parents seeking state aid for religious schools. So now the Supreme Court extended, and this is in June 21, 2022. The Supreme Court on Tuesday extended its support for religious schools, ruling that parents who send their children to these institutions have a right to tuition, and if the state provides it, to similar private schools. In a 6-3 decision in the Carson versus McCann case from Maine, could open the door to including religious schools among the charter schools that are privately run by privately ran, but publicly financed. Previously, the High Court has said that giving public funds to church schools violated the First Amendment's ban on an establishment of religion. But over the last 5 years, the court's conservative majority has flipped the equation and ruled it is unconstitutional discrimination to deny public funds to church schools simply because they are religious. They are religious. This was just extended June 21st, just a few days ago, right? Now you're saying definitely privately run schools can receive public funding and state aid, right? Now, that's on the 21st. Now we're here on the 21st, just a few days later at the end of the week. Roe versus Wade is being overturned. You got to understand, family, that this thing is heating up fast. This thing is heating up fast. And what's happening is here. So I want to show you something else. I want to show you why you can't get caught up in some of this stuff. Oh, no, that's not what I'm saying. I think that's what I read. Let me see. I might have to go back and find that. I think this is the article. Right? This is the next argument. This is just back from April. Christian nationalism is single biggest threat to America's religious freedom. Right? The interview with Amanda Tyler of the Baptist Joint Committee. But anyway, they're calling this Christian nationalism. right? Now let's look at really what's fueling this, right? Because they're claiming that it's this Christian nationalism that is on the rise that was behind this quote unquote January 2021, insurrection as Trump leaving office, and you had all of these Proud Boys and all of these folks right here storm the White House, storm the Capitol building, in which there were some fatalities that occurred. But what is it? What is it? I don't want people to get caught up in, oh, there they overturned Roe versus Wade. All praises. Don't get caught up in that. And I'm saying that for a reason. Don't get caught up in the fact that you see, oh yeah, now America's finally getting it. That now states can support our privately held schools. Don't get caught up into that. Don't get caught up into that. Because what's going on is that these Christian nationalists have put on this cloak of another extreme form of white nationalism and calling it now Christianity. And the reason why I'm saying this is because this is what I'm saying earlier about us identifying those of us who claim to be Israel, those of us who claim to be of the truth. This is why this whole Christian narrative is dangerous, right? It's dangerous. This is why this whole Christian, it's okay to call yourself a Christian thing. No. Remember what I was talking about earlier about how things over time, we were reading from the article, things over time, idioms and phrases take on different connotations and meanings based on the cultural context and political context of its time. To identify as a Christian in this country no longer holds the same weight as it did for the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century Christians who were being martyred or killed for their faith in Yahweh and believing in Yahweh Shah. But as it began to take on, this Christianity began to take on a life of its own in dealing in these different councils, debating whether or not Christ was human and divine all at the same time, the hypostatic union, whether or not he was God, whether or not he was born of a virgin, Mary, who had never had sex, which is also a false doctrinal teaching. I have to say it. The scripture doesn't teach he was born of a virgin, of a woman's womb that had never had a man physical seed implanted into it. Joseph is the biological father of Yeshua. That's just what it teaches. That's what it says. Christ doesn't argue against that. Yahweh Shai doesn't argue against that. They don't argue against that. And I'm going to tell you, if you study the cultural context of Israelites during the time of Israel, the Israelite culture of that time, there's no way his disciples, the ones that follow him, who definitely were law keepers, who kept the law, right? Even after Christ was off the scene, they still kept the law. There's no way his followers or his disciples would have even considered him to be the Mashiach or the Messiah of Israel had he not been able to trace his genealogy back to the throne of David. I'm going to just tell you that. Based on what the scripture teaches, they would have not followed him. They would have known immediately he was a fraud. If he was not able to trace his genealogy back to the throne of David, they would not have followed him. They would not have followed him. Would not have done it. They would have known he was a fraud. The scripture even deals with this when Christ goes back to his homeland, when he goes back to Nazareth, when he goes back to the town that he was raised in, and he begins to try to teach and minister, and people are following him. The people that are in that land that grew up with him in his hometown, the people that grew up with him, they began to do what? They began to mock and say, look, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this the same guy we saw as a little boy growing up around here? Clearly, he's not the one. This is why it says in his own land, he could do no miracles, because they didn't have the faith in him, right? In his message, right? That all power came from the Father, and all power that Christ had and shown came from the Father. This is what Christ says in the book of John, that he does nothing of his own power. So you have to understand that even today, wearing that cloak, and I know some, listen, I have family members who confess to be Christians, proud Christians. They confess the Christian faith. I have friends who they confess the Christian faith. Right? But it doesn't carry the meaning, the weight, and the position that I stand as a believer in the Most High, as a son of the Most High, understanding who we are today. We cannot identify what a Christian is today. That, and I believe Deacon Sakari touched on this. You can't identify yourself as a Hebrew Christian. It makes absolutely no sense. Not in the context of what a Christian means today, especially when it comes to the deification of Christ. That is idolatry. And it's deadly. So we have to understand, people, like these things that we see happening today, or Roe versus Wade being overturned, them funding now private in religious schools. These things are being put in place because this white nationalism is on the rise, and they're doing it under a cloak of Christianity. Right? This thing has to be understood, people. Has to be understood. Has to be understood. Right? So I think I've expanded my time for today. I'm going to get back into some of this later on. Most High will, the week, dealing with some of these other issues that we see. But again, as you see, the title, clearly went over and sort of went through, I believe, thoroughly in a short period of time, why all of the 12 tribes of Israel are represented in the songs of in the song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5. We see that clearly. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It is what it is. Peace to you, KOT, Prince of Yahweh. Peace to you, fam. I've been watching you, seeing what you're doing, fam, over on the platform. Hey, bro, keep representing, fam. Tanks on the ground. Appreciate you, man. You're a good brother, man, with a great spirit, man. Definitely reach out to me, man. I'm gonna try to reach out to you. I don't know if I got your information, KOT, but definitely want to reach out to you, fam. As a matter of fact, I'm about to put my email. I think you might have it though. I'm gonna put my email in the chat. You can reach out to me, KOT. Representing, fam. Representing. Definitely. So, again, family, peace and blessings. Man, watch as well as pray, family. Watch as well as pray. Don't be taken in by a lot of what we see going on. Don't be taken in by it, bro. These people have an agenda. They have an agenda. Everything you see going on in this country, don't think America is not the Babylon that the book of Revelation speaks about. Don't think America is not a part of that system. I don't care what they do that seems right. That seems right. They mean Israel, no harm. They're Confederate against Israel. Psalms 83. They're Confederate against us. Make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it, family. So with that being said, peace and blessings to you, family. Shalom, shalom.
Everywhere I go, you know I got the cycle with me. And that's just how it go until my Lord and Savior get me. Y'all just know I'll always love you. Rest in peace to Whitney. My cousins got delivered, yeah, they used to push the brick. And I remember when I couldn't even spend a penny. Went from being nifty all the way to having plenty. Now everywhere I go, it's feeling just like Christmas, cause I have a girl. And I don't even know, but I just might take a trip to Nazareth. Where we going, Phil? Nazareth. Just got back from Nazareth. Got disciple with me like I just got back from Nazareth. Got disciple with me like I just got back from Nazareth. Where we going, Phil? Nazareth. Nazareth. Just got back from Nazareth. Got disciple with me like I just got back from Nazareth. Got disciple with me like I just got back from Nazareth. Yeah, I got disciple with me. They know we be moving through the city. Got a whole team on the same they'll spray. Word to the enemy, you better not play. I ain't trying to hear nothing y'all trying to say. Got God in my heart, all in my x-ray. Straight from the bar and I came a long way from trapping that, hey. Pull up to the scene with Ray Jose. Did it show my face, we ain't even gon' stay. Giving out blessings every day, then it come right back like underlay. We got everybody so happy, like hip hip parade. Once upon a time, the devil wanted beef with me, now he eat it. Chick-fil-A.